Now, for the last couple of weeks, we have been describing how sin entered our world. But the story of Genesis 4 is the story of how sin strengthened its hold on our world. And remember what we've been saying all along. These stories are not told for the sake of historical curiosity. They are told for our instruction. Now, there are several things, but we can sort of group them into three. Three things that we want to notice about this work of sin to strengthen its hold on our lives. And the first thing that we want to notice is we want to notice the changing motivations. The changing motivations for sinful action. Now, in order to do all of this, you're going to need to keep the details of Adam and Eve's story in your mind. And that's especially true with this first thing that we want to talk about here. Because what we're doing is we are comparing and contrasting what happened in Genesis 3 with what happened in Genesis 4. And you'll see on the screen up here that I've got 4 changing motivations, okay? 4 ways that the motivation to sin has changed. But the way that I want you to think about that is I want you to think about it as different lenses that you can use to examine the same phenomenon, because that's really what it is. And in fact, you'll see that as we start to think about them, as we start to talk about them. So the first way we can look at this is that in Genesis 3, what you have is you have an external temptation. You have this serpent coming and tempting Eve, saying, hey, don't you want to do X? Of course, he never actually explicitly says, hey, go over there and eat that fruit. But that's essentially what he's doing. He's playing word games to arouse in her a temptation. Now, those of you who had brothers and sisters, you might have experienced this in your own life, right? You know, you get a little troublemaker in the family, and they're always poking and prodding somebody to do something. My mother likes to tell the story of her older sister who would do this. And one day, Grandma, my mother's mother, had left and said, okay, I don't want to hear y'all messing around or taking a shower bath. That's what Mom used to call it. I don't know why, but anyway, I don't want y'all doing that. As soon as she was out the door, Anne, my mother's older sister, was like, hey, you want to take a shower bath? Well, Mom's like, well, yeah, of course I do, but Mom said we can't do that. Oh, yeah, we can. Just trust me. Of course, Mom fell for it. And what happened when Grandma got home? She got a whooping. And it didn't matter how much she protested that Ann said you said we could do it. No. That's the kind of thing that you see here in Genesis 3, right? But Genesis 4 is more indicative of what we see in the rest of the Bible, what we often see in our lives. It's not external temptation, it's internal motivation. Another way that we could think about that is that in Genesis 3, we have this striving for some benefit, striving for something that is a blessing. Whereas in Genesis 4, what both Cain and Lamech are doing is they are addressing a grievance. Right along with that, we can say in Genesis 3, Eve, and later Adam, is pursuing the possibility of happiness. Whereas Cain and Lamech are addressing the reality of disappointment and grievance. Of disappointment and anger, I should say. You especially see that in Cain's story, right? The writer really wants you to understand what's happening here. You know, we don't know why Cain's offering was rejected. Lots of people speculated about it, and most of those speculations are wrong, frankly. Okay? We don't know why Cain's offering was rejected, and that isn't the point. The point is that Cain's upset about it, that he's angry about it. And that is the motivation for his actions. And then, of course, there's another part of this motivation, another way we can look at that whole motivation. In Genesis 3, Eve is trying to do something good for herself. In Genesis 4, yes, Cain and Lamech have turned their attention outward, but they have turned their attention outward to bring harm. And when we take all of these different lenses together and we develop a composite picture of how the motivation has changed, we can see that it has really changed. Rather than being an understandable motivation to do something positive, it is instead a motivation to do something negative. Now, it's not just the motivation itself that has changed. We also see an increasing severity of the sinful act. That's the easy one, right? You know, well, duh. You know, if you know, if you kill somebody, that's about as bad as it gets, right? Well, let's unpack that a little bit, though. Okay, let's dig into these acts that are described in this chapter. And let's begin doing that by thinking about the context, just real briefly, okay? These are things we've already mentioned, but they're things I want you to keep in mind as we think about this text, okay? So, what are the things that we should have in our mind from the context? Well, one of them is that phrase, knowing good and evil, from chapter 3, right? Well, humanity's about to really get to know evil, aren't they? This chapter, chapter 4, is what it looks like to know evil. The other thing we want to keep in mind is what I told you last week. The bringing of death into the world also brings new opportunities for sin. That's what we see unfolding in chapter 4. And what we see here are two kind of different stories that both involve the taking of a human life. Now, the first one is Cain killing his brother, and it ought to be a story of unimaginable evil, right? This is something that anybody in the ancient world would have said should never take place, especially given the premium that people in that society placed on sibling relationships, placed on family loyalty. And yet it did happen. And not only that, but there are stories in a lot of ancient Near Eastern cultures about brothers killing each other. It was a concept, a theme that a lot of ancient cultures reflected upon, probably because even though it ought to be an unimaginable evil, It wasn't unimaginable. People saw it. They experienced it. Now, what are some of the features of this imaginable evil? Well, the first thing that we see is we see Cain's misdirected aggression, right? We see his misdirected animosity. Why does he kill Abel? What did Abel do to him? Nothing, right? Abel just brought his sacrifice. He was just minding his own business, just brought his sacrifice, and all of a sudden now Cain wants to kill him. What's going on here? Well, Cain is angry at God. But of course, he can't go kill God, even if he wanted to. Who knows, he might have wanted to. But he can't go kill God. So what's the next best thing? Kill the one that God's happy with. Kill the one that God is pleased with. Kill the one whose sacrifice God accepts. It is a pattern that continues to haunt human life. Any of you who've been victims of domestic violence, you know this pattern. A man comes home from work. He's not really mad at you, but you're the one he can beat on. You're the punching bag. He can't beat on his boss because that'll get him fired or get him arrested or whatever. What he can do to you, though, is behind closed doors. And he can take out all his aggression, all of his misplaced rage on you and on your kids. Just this week, I watched one of those documentaries about a truly evil human being, a truly evil guy. His scheme was to go around and worm his way into the lives of wealthy 40 and 50-something women who were looking for love. He would haunt the dating sites and then try to build relationships with women who were well endowed financially. Okay? Well, this one lady, due to the diligence of her daughters, finally discovered what he was up to. She wouldn't believe it. She would not believe her daughters. She wouldn't listen to them. She finally figured it out. So what did he do? He tried to kill one of the daughters who had exposed him. The truth is maybe he was mad at them, but the truth is he was really mad at her because she had cut him off from his supply of money. She had cut him off, therefore, from his supply of drugs, which he was also addicted to. And more than anything, she just told him no. She had dared to stand up to him. And that really carries us to our next point about this act, this unimaginable, all too common act. It is an extreme, it is an exponential overreaction. That's the point that God is trying to make to Abel, or to Cain, I should say. It's like God saying to him, look, man, okay, I get it. You're mad at me. But if you do what is right, it's going to be okay. There's no reason to be this upset. And think about it. How should Cain have reacted when this happened? How would a normal, thoughtful person, untinged by the corrupting influence of sin, how would a normal person react? Okay, God's not happy with me. I can ask him why. Maybe there was something wrong with my attitude. Maybe there was something wrong with the presentation of the offering. I can ask God, why didn't you accept this? And how can I do it better? That would be the best option. The next best option might be walking up to God and giving him a good old-fashioned rear end chewing. How dare you not accept my offering? It at least gives God the opportunity to respond. And it recognizes, yeah, I'm mad about this, but it's still not that big of a deal. Instead, Cain explodes in unmitigated rage. Again, misplaced rage, right? And because of all of this, there's one other point we need to observe, and I don't know if you've ever thought about this before. I hadn't. Who is the first person in recorded history to die? It's not Eve. It's not Adam. It's not Cain. It's Abel, the innocent one. Do you remember when we were studying Matthew's gospel and you get to Matthew 23 and Jesus is doing all these woes against the religious authorities of his day, and he finally gets to the end of it and he kind of loses his temper and he says, all the righteous blood of every generation is going to come on this generation, and he starts with, from righteous Abel. And I've always kind of thought to myself, okay, well, what does Abel have to do with any of this? And now I get it. Abel is the example, par excellence, of what sin does to our world. Abel didn't eat of the fruit. Abel didn't kill his brother. But Abel gets the honor, if you will, of being the first human to die. It's not right, is it? And we've seen that pattern replicated over and over and over and over again in our lives. It's just a fact of criminology. A lot of times, the victims of crime are far more innocent than the ones who perpetrate it. It's just the way that it is. Now, that's not always true, of course. If you live a high-risk lifestyle, you're more likely to find yourself pushing up daisies. But that isn't the way that it always is. And we see again and again in our lives how the innocent suffer. But now let's look at Lamech, his story, okay? Because this is a story that was far more common in the ancient world and frankly in our own world. And you might even sort of generously argue that Lamech was just doing what was necessary to protect his own life. But even that explanation speaks to the ubiquity of violence. It is common enough that Lamech has to defend himself. Problem is, I don't think that's actually the most honest interpretation. Look there at what Lamech actually says to his wives. As he boasts about what he has done, he says that I killed a man, not in self-defense, but as a response to wounding me. It is, I think you could argue, an act of revenge. An act of violent vengeance. But either way, whichever way you interpret that text, the message of Genesis 4 is clear. Violence begets violence. In fact, that's why Cain's line is traced Notice there's very little details given about Cain's descendants until you get to Lamech, and then we break off Cain's story and we go back to Adam and Eve's story, and then we have the story of Seth, right? Abel's replacement. This story is told to trace out for us the ways that violence begets violence. But it isn't just the severity of this crime that is different. It isn't just the motivations. It is also the way that sin impacts character. We see that in how the crime is motivated, how it is committed, and how it is explained afterwards. How Cain and Lamech respond. And the first thing that I want to point our attention to is just the shamelessness, especially when we get to Lamech. The shamelessness. Now, what happens when Adam and Eve's sin is discovered? They actually confess what they did. Now, granted, they try to pass the buck. We talked about that last week. They try to pass the buck. Adam passes the buck to Eve. Eve passes the buck to the serpent. But at least they admit what they did. In Cain's case, it's just sort of like, brother? What brother? God has to point out to Cain, I know what you did. But when we get to Lamech, it's even worse. Lamech walks into the house, his chest puffed out, and makes this poetic proclamation of his manliness. I killed a guy today. Don't mess with me. It is something that Russell Moore, former president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, current editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, argues we are seeing more and more and more in our culture. Used to, when somebody was caught having an affair or doing something else inappropriate, they took one of two approaches. They either confessed and threw themselves on the mercy of the American public, or they lied and denied. Oh, I didn't do that. No, I never had sexual relations with that woman. Famous last words, right? Well, that's not what people do today. Now they just stand up and say, yeah, I did it. So what? And that descent into shamelessness is not only bad for our political discourse, it's not only bad for our society, it's bad for people's souls. Because as we saw when we were studying Matthew's Gospel, and as we're going to see again when we talk about sin and repentance in the Synoptic Gospels during Lent, you can't be saved if you do not repent. Period. Now, part of that is because of God's own expectations. God's not going to let you get away with that. But the other part is because of the very nature of sin itself. It corrupts our souls. And we have to recognize that corruption before we can relinquish it. I mean, I think all of you in this room, you've fought the battle with sin. You know how hard it is to fight that battle. Trying to fight that battle without admitting that you've actually done something wrong is like trying to participate in a sword fight with a blindfold on. Another thing that we see in this text is the death of sibling care. We've already touched on this, but notice Cain's reaction. It's not just sort of, who? Me? What brother? But he's also kind of like, am I my brother's keeper? One translation put it, am I my brother's guardian? Am I supposed to keep up with him? And of course, the answer that any ancient Near Eastern would have said is yes. If I need to find your brother, you're the one that I should be able to come to. Whenever a spouse goes missing, one of the first things you can look at is who reported them missing. You know, if a wife goes missing, did her husband report her missing? If a husband goes missing, did the wife report him missing? It's not perfect, of course, but if the spouse didn't report them missing, you might ought to look at the spouse. Because sometimes that says something. Sometimes it doesn't, of course, but sometimes it does. It says something about how their attitude has been affected, maybe by something that's going on. So you've got this refusal to engage in sibling care. You've also got this refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing. We've already talked about that. We've already shown that that isn't good. But let's go a step further. How about usurping divine prerogatives? Look down there at the end of Lamech's speech. So after he's thumped his chest about killing somebody, he then says, well, if Cain was avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Now you can go around if you want to, trying to defend Lamech by saying, oh, well, Lamech thinks he's innocent and therefore, that isn't the point. The point is Lamech doesn't get to make this decision. It is God's decision to decide whether he will be protected by such a curse or not. But instead, Lamech claims it for himself. And I want you to notice something else that Lamech is doing here. There is a process we talk about in social psychology called depersonalization. It's not exactly that you are denying someone their humanity or anything like that, but you are kind of emptying them of their true personhood by making them a tool for your own rhetorical or emotional purposes. That's what Lamech does here. Not just with the young man that he killed, but also with his wives. Yes, he walks in, he addresses them by name, he addresses their position, wives of Lamech. But the truth is, they're only props in his own little theater of self-aggrandizement. Now, I hope your mind is starting to spin a little bit. I hope your mind is starting to work a little bit. What happens when we treat one another that way? What happens when I really just treat you as nothing more than a prop for promoting my own interests? I'm sure you've had that happen to you in your life. And it didn't feel good, did it? And yet, it is a perennial temptation that we as humans face. The temptation to treat other people around us as nothing more than minor characters in the story of our lives, as nothing more than props in our own little personal play. Now, there's one other thing I want to kind of point out here, and I just want to poke you with this a little bit. And it's this point. The first recorded act of polygamy in the Bible is right here. Now, evangelicals have not always been terribly honest about how the Old Testament talks about sexual practices. There is nowhere in the Old Testament that clearly forbids polygamy, concubinage, which concubinage is essentially just contractual living together, or prostitution, although the law does prohibit Israelite men from selling their daughters into prostitution. There's nowhere in the Old Testament that prohibits these practices explicitly. In fact, one of the chastisements towards David when he steals Bathsheba right out of the bed of one of his bravest warriors and then has him killed is God says, look, man, if what you had was not enough, why didn't you come to me? And what David already had was 6, 7, 8, 9 wives, concubines. Nevertheless, when Jesus establishes a stricter ethic, he reaches back to Genesis, doesn't he? He reaches back to Genesis 1 and 2, and he does not do so illegitimately, I think, because I think it is instructive that this first polygamist is also the man who is boasting about his acts of violence. Violence doesn't just beget violence. Violence begets polygamy. Just this week, Christianity Today posted the second episode of their new podcast, Devil in the Deep Blue Sea. And they talked about the 1960s, early 1970s, and the spiritual and political and social changes, both good and bad, that happened during that period. And there's a line that I will never forget out of that story. Rape was just as common in Haight-Ashbury as drugs. Of course, that being one of the major hippie neighborhoods in San Francisco in the late 60s and early 70s. For sinful, corrupted men, violence and sexuality tend to go together. One expressing and empowering the other. And we see in it the most degraded aspects of humanity. Now, that's a lot of data to dump in your lap, right? So how do we make sense of it all? Well, the writer of Jeremiah puts us on the road, doesn't he? When he says, the heart is desperately wicked. The heart is, well, that's the old KJV translation. It's actually more like, the heart is desperately sick. It's incurable. It's deceitful, in fact. So much so that Jeremiah throws up his hands and says, who can understand it? The heart being the very core of who we are. You may have heard the old adage that sin will take you farther than you want to go, keep you longer than you want to stay, and cost you more than you want to pay. And that adage is true. It very succinctly summarizes everything we've talked about this morning. But what you may not know is that the man who coined that adage lived it out in his own private life. Ravi Zacharias had, unbeknownst to the public, purchased massage parlors all over the country, especially in Atlanta. And he used those massage parlors to employ women whom he then coerced into giving him sexual favors. He even told one woman, "You are my reward for all that I'm doing for the gospel." He knew the gospel. He knew the story of Scripture. And yet, his greed for sex and power ultimately discredited everything that he accomplished. What I'm here to tell you this morning is that the same thing will happen to me, will happen to you, if we don't heed the lessons of Cain and Lamech. That's why I've dumped all this data in your lap, is because I want you to see all the different vectors of attack that sin has on our lives and our character. Sin will corrupt us. And it will corrupt us so thoroughly that we no longer resemble the God who made us and the God whose image we bear. Let us pray.